You are listening to History Nest. Tonight, we follow the lifeblood of a Norse child from first breath to first blood. This is not a saga of glory. This is the marrow of existence in the frozen north. Listen closely. The wind carries voices. The birth happened during the storm moon, when the snowdrifts swallowed huts whole and wolves came down from the mountains. The mother bit down on a leather strap as the women worked between her spread legs. No screams escaped her. She knew better than to call attention during the thin hours before dawn. When the babe slid free into waiting hands, the midwife's breath caught. The child didn't cry. His eyes opened immediately dark as peat water, staring at the smoke-blackened rafters as if recognizing them. They called him Rold, for his grandfather's sword. A strong name, a name that demanded repayment in deeds. Rold's world unfolded in the grays and browns of the longhouse. The constant reek of fish oil and wet wool. The way his mother's spindle whirred like some living creature in the corner. His earliest memory? The knife. His father's seeks being sharpened by firelight. The rhythmic scrape of whetstone on steel that meant safety and danger in equal measure. At 3 winters, Rold learned his first truth. Warmth meant life. He watched an infant cousin blue-lipped and still, wrapped in linen and taken to the burial mounds. That night, he piled extra furs over his younger sister without being told. 5 winters brought responsibilities. Fetching water from the stream that never fully froze, though the rocks wore beards of ice. Rold's small hands grew red and cracked. One morning, he found the water hole iced over with an unnatural sheen black as obsidian. When he broke through, the reflection staring back wasn't his own. He ran home with empty buckets. No punishment came. That evening, his father placed an iron nail in his porridge bowl. The forest taught its own lessons. At 7 winters, Rold could identify every mushroom that meant death. At 8, he learned to set snares that broke necks cleanly. But the pines whispered secrets too. Sometimes his traps held nothing but clumps of moss shaped like screaming faces. Once, he found a hare still alive, its belly slit open in a perfect straight line, and filled with smooth white pebbles. His initiation came at 12 winters. The men took him to the sacred grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle. They gave him the trial cup bitter with herbs and something metallic. The visions came swiftly. A woman with antlers standing knee-deep in the fjord, his own face rotting on a battlefield. When he woke vomiting bile, his father smeared the mess across Rold's forehead in runic patterns. "You've seen the hidden now," the chieftain grunted. "They've seen you back." That summer, the fishing dwindled. Strange lights danced on the water at night. An infant was born with teeth like a wolf. The elders muttered of debts unpaid. On the night of the blood moon, they came for Rold with torches and rope. His first kill wasn't human. Not exactly. The thing in the bog wore his uncle's face, but its skin peeled back like birch bark when the knife went in. What spilled out wasn't blood, but a swarm of black moths that dissolved in the torchlight. The men nodded approval. His father handed him the seeks properly this time, handle first. That winter, Rold's sister disappeared. They found her doll at the tree line, its straw stuffing replaced with animal bones. The adults spoke of wolves. Rold knew better. He'd seen the footprints, bare human feet leading into the forest. But the stride was twice too long, and the toes left no impressions. On his 14th birthday, Rold took his first proper wound, a gash along his ribs from a boar hunt. The women stitched it with sinew, but the flesh around the cut turned gray and hard as horn. It didn't hurt, didn't bleed, just existed. That night, he dreamt of a ship with sails made of skin, and woke with salt in his mouth. The thing assembled at equinox. Strange news came from neighboring villages. Livestock born with extra eyes, wells that sang at midnight. The law speaker read the omens. The veil was thinning. Sacrifices were demanded. Rold watched as they led the thrall forward, saw how the man's eyes kept flickering to the tree line. Not in fear, in recognition. When the blade fell, the earth itself sighed. The blood steamed where it hit the frost. Later, Rold would swear he saw the shadows between the trees lean forward to drink. Spring came late that year. The thaw revealed what the snows had hidden, entire families gone from their beds, meals left half-eaten, doors unbarred from the inside. The surviving children drew disturbing pictures in the mud. Tall figures with too many joints, always watching from just beyond the firelight. On the night of his 15th winter, Rold took his father's axe and went to the standing stones alone. What happened there isn't spoken of, but when he returned at dawn, his hair had turned white at the temples. The axe blade was notched as if chewed. He placed it on the chieftain's threshold without a word. That evening, the village dogs began howling in unison. Not in alarm, in answer to something. The dreams began in the month of the midnight sun, when the sky bled into the sea and time lost meaning. Rold would wake with the taste of salt on his tongue, his fingers clutching furs that reeked of damp wool and something fouler, like meat left to rot in a sealed jar. The visions clung to him, a ship cutting through fog so thick it resembled pus. Sails stitched from flayed skin, the nipples and navels still visible. Figures standing at the prow, their faces obscured by helmets made from not metal at all. His wound, the gray, dead flesh along his ribs, began weeping a thin black fluid when the dreams came. The village healer burned herbs over it, chanting to Frigg. The smoke curled away from his skin as if repelled. First omen, the day the seals beached themselves. 30 of them, all bull males in their prime, dragged themselves onto the rocks below the village at high tide. Not sick, not wounded. Their eyes had been removed with surgical precision, the sockets packed with dull seaweed. The children laughed and poked at the still twitching bodies until the elders drove them away with switches. Rold watched as the men slit the bellies open. No blubber, no organs, just hollow cavities filled with cold seawater that should have drained out hours past. That night, the village dogs tore out their own throats against their tethers. The thing assembled. Law speaker Thorgest stood on the oath stone, his ceremonial axe trembling in hands that had never shaken before. "We have angered the hidden ones," he declared. The usual platitudes about sacrifices and piety died in his throat when someone pointed to his shadow. It wasn't his. The shape stretching long across the trampled grass wore a helmet with too many horns. His fingers ended in hooks. The village voted to send a party north to the old offering caves. 7 men, 7 women, rolled among them not by choice, but because his father gripped his arm hard enough to leave bruises in the shape of runes. "You brought this," the man hissed. "You fix it." The march. They found the first marker stone after 3 days' walk, a basalt pillar carved with warnings so old even Thorgest couldn't read them. The second stone stood snapped in half, the broken edges chewed. On the 5th night, Ragna the weaver disappeared. They found her boots by the fire, still laced. Inside each, a complete set of toe bones, polished clean and arranged smallest to largest. Rold woke to whispering in a language that hurt his teeth. Behind his eyelids, he saw a woman kneeling in a tide pool washing something red. A hand, not hers, rising from the water to stroke her hair. Her face when she turned blank as uncarved wood. The caves. The entrance yawned like a sick man's mouth, exhaling air that smelled of wet iron and spoiled milk. What happened inside gets told in fragments. Thorgest cutting his own tongue out with his ritual knife. The way the torchlight made the stalactites drip black. The sound of something large moving in the deeper dark, not walking. Slithering in segments. The runes on the walls, not carved, grown like lichen spelling doom. Rolled alone emerged. They found him at the tree line 3 days later, naked except for a cloak of reindeer moss. His hair had gone completely white. In his hands, 7 human teeth strung on a sinew cord. When questioned, he simply pointed north toward the sea. That evening, the fishermen reported a strange mist on the horizon. It moved against the wind, and within it the faint outline of sails. The ship came ashore on a moonless night when the tide should have been retreating. Instead, the black water clung to the beach like a starving man clutching bread, leaving the vessel stranded in the shallows. Its hull rose from the waves like the ribcage of some colossal beast, planks sewn together with sinew that still twitched in the cold air. The mast, a single, curved bone polished smooth by centuries of use, leaned drunkenly toward the village, its shadow cutting across the shoreline like an accusing finger. Rold stood apart from the gathering crowd, his fingers worrying the necklace of teeth taken from the cave. The wound along his ribs had changed in the weeks since his return. The gray flesh now formed ridges that opened and closed with his breathing, tiny slits that tasted the salt wind and trembled when the wind came from the east. He didn't need to wade into the surf to know the water would feel warm against them. By morning, the first changes became apparent. The village wells, dug deep into sweet groundwater, now spat up brackish liquid that stank of rotting kelp. Those who dared drink reported first a cloying sweetness, then a squirming sensation in their bellies, and finally voices, not their own, bubbling up with their vomit. The children took to sleepwalking, their small bodies drawn to the shoreline where they stood knee-deep in the frigid water, mouths slack, eyes clouded white as dead fish. When dragged back to their beds, they scratched at the walls until their fingers bled, whispering of the bone woman who combed her hair with a human rib just beyond the breakers. The antlered figure from Rold's initiation dreams now appeared regularly at twilight, standing waist-deep in the surf. She never approached the village, never spoke. But her presence sent the gulls screaming inland and turned the tide pools black with fleeing crabs. Rold found himself drawn to the rocks each evening, his wound weeping thin strands of black fluid that hissed when they struck the stones. The woman watched him with eyes that reflected no light, while behind her, shadows moved beneath the water. Too many limbs, too few heads, things that might have been human once or merely wore human shapes as they walked the seafloor on stolen feet. At the emergency thing gathering, Law-Speaker Thorgest's shadow no longer matched his movements. Where the old man gestured weakly with his ceremonial axe, his silhouette reared up with too many arms, its helmeted head sporting antlers not unlike the sea woman's. The villagers voted without debate. Rold's father would be bound to the sacred oak at dawn, not as punishment but as plea. Your bloodline woke them, Thorgest rasped through the ruin of his sacrificed tongue. Your bloodline must put them back to sleep. The sacrifice changed nothing. That night, every bitch in the village whelped stillborn pups with human hands curled against their chests. The tides came in faster, higher, the water now warm as blood where it lapped at the doorsteps. And in his dreams, Rold saw the skin-sailed ship was not alone. A fleet of them waited beyond the horizon, their masts like a forest of bones against the stormlight. He woke on the beach at low tide, salt crusting his eyelids, the ship gone. In its place, 7 teeth embedded where the mast had stood, his father's skull staring skyward from the titterline, and inside his own mouth, a new molar growing where none had been, its surface etched with the same runes as the cave walls. When he touched it, the antlered woman's voice vibrated in his marrow. You are the harbor now. The waves sighed back in a language only his wound understood. The new tooth in Rold's mouth ached when it rained. Not the dull throb of normal pain, but a sharp, insistent pressure that seemed to originate behind his eyes and vibrate through his skull. By the time the spring storms came, the tooth had grown to twice the size of its neighbors, its rune-carved surface blackening like old bone left in the tide. He tested its edge against his tongue often, relishing how it split the flesh with effortless precision. The blood tasted of salt and copper, familiar, yet wrong, as if something inside him had soured. The village noticed. They always did. Old Thorgest, what remained of him, took to crossing the square whenever Rold approached, his remaining eye rolling in its socket like a frightened horse's. The children whispered that the law speaker's shadow had finally eaten the rest of him. There was truth in this. Where Thorgest shuffled, his silhouette moved with liquid grace, its elongated fingers brushing the ground where no light should have cast such shapes. The villagers gave them both wide berth now, though they still left offerings at Rold's door. Bowls of sour milk, bundles of sage that withered by morning, and sometimes, when desperation outweighed fear, a child's lost tooth wrapped in lamb's wool. Rold collected these gifts without comment, adding them to the growing pile in the corner of his hut. They served no purpose he could name, yet he knew with animal certainty that they must not be discarded. At night, the dreams worsened. He stood on a shore that was not his own, watching the skin-sailed ships draw nearer. Their decks teemed with shapes that defied counting. Sometimes 3 limbs, sometimes 8, their numbers shifting each time he blinked. The antlered woman waited at the water's edge, her hands busy with some unseen task. When he tried to approach, the ground gave way beneath him, plunging him into water so cold it burned. Then the voices came, not through his ears but through the gaps between his ribs where the gills now fluttered. "You are the door," they whispered in a tongue older than runes. "You are the hinge." He woke each time with his mouth full of seawater and sand, his bedding soaked through despite the hut's dryness. The tooth throbbed in time with the waves. By the thaw's end, the first true change came. Rold was mending a fishing net when the pain struck, a white-hot lance through his jaw. He spat into the sand and stared at the result. A perfect white pebble, smooth as glass, its surface etched with the same markings as his tooth. When he lifted it, the stone pulsed warm against his palm. The sea sighed in answer. That evening, a boy from the village went missing. They found his boots by the shore, laces neatly tied, each toe stuffed with damp moss arranged in careful spirals. The villagers looked to Rold then, their faces slack with something beyond fear. He said nothing, only turned his face toward the sea where the mist hung unnaturally thick. Inside his mouth, a second tooth began to grow. The second tooth cut through Rold's gums on the night the rains came. Not the gentle showers of spring, but a torrent that fell in thick ropes of water, pounding the village into mud. It emerged not as a normal molar, but as a curved spike of yellowed ivory, its surface grooved like the antlered woman's comb. When he ran his tongue along its edge, the taste of old blood flooded his mouth, and for one blinding moment, he saw through her eyes. The village from offshore, its fires smothered, its people scurrying like beetles in the downpour. The pebble he'd coughed up now lived in his pocket, warm as a fresh-killed heart, pulsed in time with the tides. By morning, 3 more children had vanished. Not just their boots this time. Their entire homes stood empty, doors swinging in the wind, meals left half-eaten. In one hut, the family dog lay eviscerated, its belly slit open and filled with smooth white stones arranged in spiral patterns. The villagers didn't bother searching. They knew where the lost had gone. Their eyes followed Rold as he walked to the shore each dusk, his gait uneven now, his shoulders hunched against a weight only he could feel. The sea had changed. Where once the waves rolled in with predictable rhythm, they now moved like a living thing testing its boundaries. The water clung to the beach long after high tide should have receded, leaving behind strands of black seaweed that twitched when approached. Fishermen reported catches with human teeth lining their gills, their bellies swollen with unidentifiable bones. One man swore he'd hauled in a net full of eels only to find them knotted together in the shape of a rune, one that matched the carving on Rold's tooth. At the abandoned Thingstead, Thorgest's shadow had grown bold. No longer tethered to the old man's movements, it slithered between the standing stones after dark, its antlered head brushing the lowest branches of the oaks. The lost speaker himself had been reduced to a shambling wreck, his remaining eye milky with cataracts, his lips sewn shut with his own hair. Yet somehow he still spoke, a wet, guttural clicking that emanated from his chest rather than his mouth. The villagers left offerings at his feet now too. Iron nails, locks of hair, the occasional still warm heart plucked from a sacrificial goat. Rold no longer dreamed. When he closed his eyes, he simply went elsewhere. The antlered woman awaited him in those moments, her hands busy with some endless weaving. The material she used glistened in the moonlight, strips of something that might have been skin or kelp or both. Behind her, the skin-sailed ships drew nearer, their decks teeming with shapes that defied description. They brought gifts, a necklace of human teeth, smaller than his, clearly a child's, a cloak stitched from gull feathers and something slicker, a knife carved from a single blackened bone. He accepted these without question, knowing each item carried a price he'd pay later. The breaking point came on the night of the blood moon. The villagers, those who remained, cornered Rold at the sacred grove. They carried torches that burned with unnatural blue flame and weapons edged in silver. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man who might have been Rold's cousin in another life, stepped forward, his axe trembling. "Enough," the man growled. "We give you to them." Rold smiled then, his too many teeth gleaming in the torchlight. He opened his mouth to speak, and the sea answered for him. A wave taller than the longhouses crashed through the trees, its crest foaming with shapes that might have been arms or fins or both. The water didn't recede. It stayed, knee-deep and rising, as the first of the skin-sailed ships ground ashore between the sacred oaks. From its deck, the antlered woman extended a hand. Rold took it. Behind him, the screaming began. The waiting lasted 7 days and 7 nights. Rold stood motionless at the ship's prow as the sea changed around them. The water grew thick, viscous, more like broth than ocean, swirling with strands of black kelp that coiled around the hull with purposeful intent. The antlered woman had ceased her weaving, the unfinished net now draped across her shoulders like a stole of frozen mist. Together they watched the abandoned village, its crooked longhouses creaking in the unnatural tide, their barnacle-encrusted walls pulsing like the throat of some great beast mid-swallow. On the morning of the 3rd day, the first bones surfaced. They rose gently from the depths, white against the dark water. A ribcage first, then a skull, then the delicate finger bones of what might have been a child. The skeleton assembled itself with eerie precision, each fragment clicking into place as if drawn by invisible strings. When complete, it stood waist-deep in the shallows, its empty eye sockets fixed on Rold. Then it bowed. More followed. By noon, the bay teemed with walking bones, some human, some not, some in configurations that defied earthly anatomy. They moved with purpose along the seabed, gathering stones, arranging driftwood, building something in the ruins of the village. Their silence was absolute save for the occasional click of joint against joint, a sound that set Rold's teeth on edge. The antlered woman placed her hand, cold as deep water, against the back of his neck. Through the contact came understanding. These were not the drowned villagers. These were older, much older. The bones worked through the night. By dawn, they had constructed a throne of sorts, a grotesque amalgamation of whale vertebrae and shattered longship planks, its arms ending in clenched skeletal fists, its high back adorned with the antlers of creatures no living man had hunted. The seat itself was lined with something that shimmered wetly in the pale light, shifting color when viewed from different angles. Rold knew his place. He waded ashore, the water parting before him with unseemly eagerness. The bones fell still as he passed, their skulls turning to track his progress. When he reached the throne, the antlered woman was already there, her fingers tracing the grooves in the armrests, grooves that matched the patterns on Rold's teeth. He sat. The moment his flesh touched the throne, the visions came. A city beneath the waves, its spires crafted from shipwrecks, its streets paved with teeth. The antlered woman as she once was. Not a goddess but a girl, drowning, her mouth full of promises to any god who would listen. The first ships they'd sent ashore, their sails stitched from the skins of unbelievers. And himself not as he was now but as he would be. A bridge between worlds, a living altar, a harbinger of the great drowning to come. The bones knelt. Out in the bay, the skin-sailed ship began to change. Its mast stretched upward, the single curved bone branching into antlers that mirrored the woman's own. The hull split open along its seams, revealing row upon row of new teeth, each one carved with runes that steamed in the morning air. Rold raised his hand when had it become so pale, so webbed between the fingers, and pointed north. The bones followed his gaze. On the horizon, barely visible through the mist, other villages waited, other shores, other thrones yet to be filled. The antlered woman smiled her terrible smile and began to hum again. This time, Rold recognized the tune. It was the same one the village women had sung to lull restless children to sleep. The water, now up to his knees and rising, grew warmer. The change in Rold's body accelerated after the throne accepted him. His skin, once weathered by Nordic winds, now shone with an unnatural pallor, like parchment left too long in brine. The webbing between his fingers had thickened into translucent membranes that pulsed with each tide's rhythm. Most disturbing were his eyes. The irises had dissolved into milky pools, their surface reflecting not light but the constant movement of deep water shadows. At high tide, the antlered woman placed her cold hands upon his temples and whispered the old words. Salt crystallized along his hairline, forming jagged ridges that grew with each lunar cycle. By the third moon, they had fused into a crude crown, its points uneven like broken teeth, its weight causing his neck to bend forward at a perpetual angle. The bones brought offerings, a whale's rib carved with faces of drowned villagers, kelp strands knotted into nooses, smooth stones from riverbeds far inland, each bearing a single bloody fingerprint. Rold arranged these at the throne's base with fingers that left damp prints on everything they touched. The objects hummed when placed correctly, vibrating against the earth in discordant harmony. One evening, as the tide receded farther than ever before, revealing black sand that had never before seen air, the skeletons assembled something new. From driftwood and the shattered remains of fishing boats, they constructed a procession of grotesque figures, each crowned with antlers fashioned from deer bones, each with a gaping mouth carved where no mouth should be. These effigies faced inland, their empty eye sockets watching the forest paths where traders once came. The water that pooled around Rold's throne no longer tasted of salt. It carried the metallic tang of blood, though no wound bled nearby. When he dipped his hands into it, the liquid clung to his skin like oil, forming patterns that resembled the rune for journey, a branching river system, something that might have been a map. The antlered woman studied these markings with her head cocked, then pressed her thumb against Rold's forehead hard enough to break the skin. The blood that welled up was black and moved against gravity, crawling upward to trace the contours of his salt crown. That night, the first invasion of dreams began. Sleeping villagers in settlements along the coast awoke screaming of a pale figure standing at the foot of their beds, water dripping from its antlers. Those brave enough to approach their local seers found the wise women already waiting. Their eyes rolled back in trance, chanting in voices that bubbled as if submerged. The door is open, the hinge turns. The tide comes for the unbelievers. By month's end, fishermen refused to launch their boats, claiming the waves moved wrong, curling backward against the wind. Their nets came up heavy with broken pottery glazed with unfamiliar sigils, fish whose scales formed human faces, one intact skull with Rold's teeth marks grooved into the forehead. The antlered woman collected these artifacts with unusual care, arranging them around the throne in patterns that made the air vibrate. When complete, the arrangement pulsed like a heartbeat, sending ripples through the standing water that lapped at Rold's feet. On the morning the first coastal village fell silent, Rold's crown cracked open down the middle. From the fissure oozed a substance neither liquid nor solid, that formed shapes as it fell. A drowning man reaching upward, a ship with tattered sails, a woman holding something that squirmed. The antlered woman caught this secretion in her palms and smeared it across Rold's eyelids. When he blinked, his vision shifted. He could now see the faint glow of every water source for miles, connected by shimmering threads that all led back to his throne. And pulsing along those threads, hunger. The first village fell without resistance. Rold saw it through the milky film covering his eyes, a vision rippling across the salt water constantly weeping from his crown. The coastal settlement's wooden palisades stood unmanned, their gates yawning open like the mouths of beached fish. Inside, the villagers moved in slow procession toward the shore, their eyes glazed with shared dreams, their footprints filling with black water as soon as lifted from the sand. The antlered woman had grown taller. Her antlers now scraped the underside of low clouds when she stood at full height, their points dripping a substance that hardened into chimes in the sea wind. She no longer walked. She flowed, her lower half dissolving into mist when the tide receded, reforming with each new wave. At the throne's base, the offerings had begun to move on their own. The whale rib tapped against the stones in perfect rhythm with Rold's slowing heartbeat. The kelp nooses swayed without wind, their loops tightening around invisible necks. Worst were the fingerstones. They migrated each night, arranging themselves in patterns that resembled the coastline as seen from above, a branching network of veins. Something that might have been a face. Rold's hands had become tools of the tide. When he pressed them against the throne's armrests, salt water seeped from his pores, carving new channels into the already grooved bone. These patterns mirrored the ones appearing on his chest, raised welts that formed and reformed like tide charts for unseen shores. The dreams spread inland. Shepherds awoke with their beards stiff with salt crystals, screaming of drowning in fields miles from any water. Children drew disturbing images in the mud. Tall figures with antlers standing just beyond the firelight, their arms outstretched in invitation. The village seers, those who hadn't yet succumbed, reported hearing the sea in their dreams. Not the usual crash of waves, but something worse. The sound of breathing vast and wet, as if the ocean itself had lungs. The bones grew bolder. No longer content to remain near shore, they began appearing at woodland springs and mountain streams, always working, always building. Farmers found strange structures erected overnight, altars of stacked vertebrae at crossroads, arches formed from interlocked pelvises spanning creek beds, groves where trees wore necklaces of finger bones. These constructions hummed when touched, vibrating at a frequency that made teeth ache. Birds avoided them. Insects died within arm's reach. And always, the faint smell of low tide clung to the stones beneath them. Rold's throne had begun to sink. Day by day, the black sand swallowed it deeper, the ground turning spongy and cold. The skeletons worked tirelessly to shore it up with driftwood and the ribs of sea creatures, but their efforts seemed almost ceremonial, as if they welcomed the inevitable. On the night of the new moon, the antlered woman brought Rold a new gift, a conch shell grown through with veins of gold. When he pressed it to his ear, what remained of it, the cartilage had softened into something more suited to water. He heard the screams of the next village to fall, the creak of ships' timbers in deep water, and beneath it all, a voice neither male nor female that spoke a single word. Come! His salt crown shattered then, the pieces dissolving into the water pooling at his feet. The liquid swirled upward, forming a perfect sphere before his face, a miniature ocean containing 9 ships with sails of flayed skin, something moving beneath them vast and patient, and reflected on the surface, Rold's face as it would soon be, no longer recognizably human. The water fell, the vision ended, and in villages across the region, every container of liquid wells, rain barrels, even the morning dew, turned abruptly, irrevocably salty. The salt had seeped into everything. Farmers plowing their fields found the earth crusted white, each furrow filling with briny water that reflected not the sky, but something moving beneath the soil. Children's tears left stinging tracks on their cheeks, their sweat tasting of ocean spray even miles inland. At night, the very air grew heavy with moisture that pooled in strange patterns, forming perfect circles on doorsteps, spirals in haylofts, and occasionally, along the walls of still-occupied homes, the unmistakable outline of towering antlers. Rold no longer resembled anything born of human flesh. His body had elongated, spine curving to accommodate the weight of the new growths along his back, ridges of calcified tissue that clicked together like shells in a current. The webbing between his fingers now reached to the second knuckle, the membranes thick and veined with pulsating channels that darkened when the tide turned. His mouth was no longer his own. The teeth had fused into a continuous ridge of yellowed ivory, the runes carved into them glowing faintly blue when submerged. They ached constantly now, a deep, throbbing pain that resonated with the movement of distant waves. When he opened his jaws too wide, salt water poured forth in a never-ending stream, its viscosity changing with the moon's phase. The antlered woman rarely left his side. She had grown gaunt, her once majestic antlers now brittle and covered in strange nodules that wept black fluid. Her fingers, too long, too many, constantly worked at something only she could see, weaving invisible threads through the air that hummed when touched. At night, she pressed her forehead to Rold's and exhaled a breath that smelled of deep trenches and things best left unremembered. The visions this brought were worse than before. Mountains crumbling into the sea, forests of kelp where oaks once stood, people with too many eyes lining the shores, their mouths moving in unison. The skeletons had multiplied. No longer confined to coastal areas, they marched inland along riverbeds and underground streams, their bony feet leaving no prints in the sodden earth. Where they passed, the water changed. Brook trout swam upside down, their bellies split open to reveal tiny humanoid teeth. Frogs grew translucent skin, their pulsing organs visible beneath as they sang in voices that mimicked drowned children. In what remained of the villages, the final transformations began. Those who had resisted the dreams longest awoke to find their beds floating in shallow water, though no flood had come. Their limbs moved sluggishly, joints popping with each motion as if filled with fluid. The lucky ones still had mouths. The less fortunate found their faces smooth below the nose, their nourishment now coming through patches of porous skin that filtered nutrients directly from the brackish air. At the center of it all, Rold's throne had sunk completely. Only the very top remained visible, a single antlered skull staring blankly skyward from the ever-growing pool. The water here was different, thick as oil, warm as blood, and infinitely deep. Fish avoided it, Birds that flew too close fell in and did not resurface. And sometimes, when the wind died completely, something far below stirred, sending ripples across the surface in perfect geometric patterns. On the morning the last village fell silent, the antlered woman led Rold to the pool's edge. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The water welcomed him like a lover. As he sank beneath the surface, the final change overtook him. His bones hollowing, his skin splitting in precise lines, his consciousness expanding to encompass every salt-contaminated stream, every tainted well, every tear shed by the transformed. Somewhere in the deep, something ancient opened its eyes, and somewhere above, the first of the new ships reached shore. The first ship made landfall at dusk, its hull scraping against stones that had never known tide. It was not the skin-sailed horror that had taken Rold. This vessel was newer, cruder, built from the remains of fishing boats and the bones of those who had resisted the change. Its mast stood unnaturally straight, carved from a single oak that still bled sap where the nails had been driven. The sails, stitched from the tanned hides of transformed villagers, billowed with winds that blew against the natural currents. On the shore, the waiting delegation trembled. They were not the same people who had first succumbed to the dreams. Generations had passed in the inland kingdoms, enough time for the coastal horrors to fade into legend, for warning stones to be buried beneath new settlements. These men wore fine woolens dyed in earthy hues, their beards carefully oiled, their boots sturdy and unaccustomed to salt, their weapons, honed for hunting boar and the occasional border skirmish, hung useless at their sides as the ship's gangplank lowered with a groan like a dying man's last breath. What emerged froze the blood in their veins. The sailors moved all wrong, their limbs bent at impossible angles, their heads lolling as if suspended by invisible strings. Their skin had taken on the pallor of creatures that had never seen sunlight, stretched taut over bones that clicked with each step. And their eyes were Rold's eyes, milky, unblinking, filled with the movement of deep water. The delegation's leader, a broad-shouldered man with the crest of his house embroidered on his tunic, found his voice first. We come in peace." The nearest sailor tilted its head, the motion sending a trickle of seawater from its ear. When it spoke, the voice came not from its mouth but from the puddles forming at the delegation's feet. Peace! The word bubbled up between their toes, the liquid impossibly cold. There is no peace in the deep. Behind the first ship, the horizon darkened with sails. The march inland. By the next moon, the rivers ran backward. The salt-born did not conquer, they corrupted. Their very presence altered the land in subtle, terrible ways. Wells spat up briny water that whispered in dead languages. Livestock gave birth to malformed young that instinctively sought running water. Orchards bore fruit that burst with seawater when bitten. The kingdoms mobilized their armies, of course. Proud knights in gleaming mail rode forth to meet the encroaching tide, their banners fluttering in the stale air. They found no enemy to fight, only abandoned villages where the hearths still glowed with blue flame, where the cobblestones wept black tears, where every mirror reflected not the viewer's face but the endless dark beneath the waves. The few survivors spoke in hushed tones of the processions, lines of their neighbors walking single file into the nearest body of water, their faces serene, their hands clasped around strange talismans, a child's finger bone wrapped in kelp, polished stone with Rold's runes, a conch that pulsed like a living heart. Those who tried to stop them reported feeling an impossible pressure in their chests, as if their very blood sought to escape and join the sea. The drowned cathedral, at the heart of the spreading blight, the original village had become something else. The long houses had melted together into a grotesque cathedral of warped wood and bleached bones, its spires reaching like drowning men's fingers toward the sky. The roof pulsed with some internal rhythm, its shingles now formed from the fused scales of transformed fish. Inside, the skeletons of the first villagers hung suspended in webs of braided seaweed, their jaws working soundlessly in perpetual prayer. At the center of it all, where Rold's throne had once stood, there was now only a hole, a perfect circle of black water that reflected no light. The antlered woman, or what remained of her, circled its edge, her form flickering between solid and mist, her voice the hiss of waves on stone. She was waiting, they all were, for the great tide, for the waking, for the moment when the door, now creaking on its hinges, would finally swing wide. The antlered woman remembered. Fragments surfaced through the brine of her consciousness. A girl's hands, her hands, clutching at seaweed as the storm waves pummeled her father's fishing boat. The exact moment when the salt water had filled her lungs, burning away prayers to gods who did not answer. Then, the offering, not hers, theirs. The things from the deep had come with promises whispered through the hiss of escaping air. Live, they'd said as her vision darkened. Serve, they'd said, as something cold pressed against her lips. Prepare, they'd said, when she awoke coughing up black water on a shore that was not her own. Now, centuries later, she stood in the drowned cathedral as the first true storm gathered beyond its warped arches. The time of preparation neared its end. The scholar's last testament. In the last free monastery of the northern reaches, Brother Eilif dipped his quill in ink gone brackish from the humid air. His hands shook not from age, though he had plenty, but from the visions that now came unbidden. On this third day of the bleeding spring, I commit to parchment what cannot be unseen. The coastal horrors are no longer content with shoreline conquest. They come inland through our very veins. Yesterday, young Olaf returned from checking the fish traps with his eyes fully black. He spoke perfect Latin though never taught, describing cities beneath glaciers where the frozen dead twitched toward some unheard rhythm. When we bound him, his sweat pooled on the flagstones in shapes matching ancient runes not seen since the First Age. This morning, the well water turned viscous, pours like syrup yet weighs nothing in the cup. Brother Arnfast drank but a sip and now recites names we've never heard in a voice not his own. The names sound like, here the ink blurred, as if the page had been briefly submerged. The next lines crawled with unnatural precision. They say the first drowning was not an accident. They say she was chosen. They say we will meet her soon. The final entry, written in different ink, darker, thicker. The rain tastes of memory tonight. I hear my mother's voice calling from the cellar, though she died 20 winters past. When I open my mouth to answer, only seawater comes forth. God forgive me. I think I understand now. The journal ended there. Outside the monastery walls, the first salt-born scouts crested the hill, their bodies glistening in the moonlight. The cathedral's heart. The black pool at the cathedral center had begun to bubble. Not with heat, with something far worse. Each eruption released sounds that defied mortal ears. The scream of a sinking ship's timbers, the wet crunch of a seal's skull breaking under ice, the last gasp of every drowning victim since the world began. The antlered woman, girl, creature, harbinger, knelt at its edge, her antlers now grown into the cathedral's very structure, their branching tips fused with the ceiling beams. She no longer had lips to speak, yet the water answered her unvoiced thoughts. A whirlpool formed, its center revealing glimpses of that first doomed fishing boat. Shadows moved in the depths, their shapes hinting at what had really happened that storm-lashed night. And always, always, the sense of something vast beginning to stir from ancient slumber. The saltborn gathered around her, their bodies bending at impossible angles in worship. They had no eyes left to weep, but the salt crusting their faces spoke of endless sorrow. This close to the pool, their true forms became apparent. Not monsters, but victims. Every man, woman, and child who had ever been taken by the sea now had a counterpart here, their bodies reshaped into instruments of the coming tide. Rold's presence permeated everything. His essence flowed through the brackish wells poisoning the countryside. His voice whispered through the conch talismans clutched by the walking drowned. And when the transformed villagers opened their mouths to speak, it was his ruined face that flickered in the mist between their teeth. The time between waves crashing against the cathedral walls grew shorter. The pool's bubbling became more insistent, and in the last strongholds of humanity, children awoke screaming of a great door opening beneath their beds. The antlered woman remembered her promise. She reached into the pool. The water remembered too. The rain fell thick as broth across the drowning world. It pooled in footprints and wagon ruts, reflecting not the storm-choked sky but something moving beneath the water's skin. Something that watched from beneath the surface of every puddle, every rain barrel, every tear shed by the remaining untainted. Children whispered of faces forming in the liquid darkness between floorboards. Old women hung charms of iron and rowan over their thresholds, only to find the metal corroded to lace and the berries bursting with salt water by morning. At the edge of the still-free territories, the last war band gathered. They were not the proud warriors of saga and song. These were farmers turned fighters, their weapons scythes and wood axes reforged for battle, their armor consisting of layered wool and desperation. At their center stood a girl of 16 winters. Astrid, they called her, though no one remembered who had first given her the name. She alone among them bore no scars from the changing world. When the others pressed her about this immunity, she would only open her mouth and show them. Her tongue had been cut out years before the first ship came. Now she led through gesture and example, her pale eyes missing nothing. When the war band discovered their first salt-born scout, a twitching thing lashed to a tree with its own intestines, it was Astrid who recognized the pattern in its convulsions. She traced the movements in the mud, revealing a perfect map of the region's waterways. Where the rivers converged, she drew a circle. The salt-born were herding them, the crones warning. Deep in what remained of the birch forests, the last untainted seer crouched in a cave lined with the skins of stillborn deer. Her fingers, knotted with arthritis, worked a piece of driftwood into something resembling a woman with antlers. "They think it's about drowning," she whispered to the shadows. "They're wrong." The wood figurine came alive in her hands, its tiny limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Black sap oozed from its joints, forming words on the cave floor. First there was the hunger, then came the salt. Last will be the silence. Outside, the rain intensified. The puddles at the cave's entrance began to ripple against the wind. The crone sighed and reached for her skinning knife. She had just begun to carve the first protective rune into her forearm when the water at her feet formed hands and pulled her under. The figurine continued jerking for 3 days after. The cathedral expands. Rold's consciousness now pulsed through every contaminated droplet. He watched from rain-soaked leaves as Astrid's war band slogged northward. He listened through the water in their waterskins as they whispered plans of resistance. And when the youngest among them, a boy who still believed in old gods, stopped to relieve himself against an oak, Rold tasted the fear in his urine. The salt-born no longer needed to fight. Their mere presence altered the land in preparation. Farmsteads melted like wax, the timbers flowing into the earth to form strange new structures. Roads unspooled themselves, the stones rearranging into spirals that led nowhere. Wildlife grew translucent, their organs visible as they performed instinctive tasks with robotic precision. At the cathedral's heart, the black pool had begun to sing. The antlered woman, what little remained of her, stood vigil as the waters churned. Her body had become part of the structure itself. Ribs fused with archways, vertebrae forming buttresses, her antlers the cathedral's crown. Only her face remained, floating just beneath the surface of the central pool. When she blinked, entire villages vanished beneath sudden floods. When she smiled, the stars reflected in the water spelled out names no human throat could pronounce. Astrid's choice. The war band reached the high ground overlooking the drowned lands just as the last defenses fell. Below them, the world had become something from a fever dream. Trees grew upside down, their roots cradling globes of black water. Buildings breathed, their thatched roofs rising and falling like chests. The sky mirrored the sea so perfectly it hurt to look at. At the center stood the cathedral, its spires now visible above the unnatural horizon. The very air around it shimmered, as if reality itself had grown thin. Astrid turned to her followers and signed a single word: home. Then she walked alone toward the cathedral, her boots leaving no prints in the sodden earth. Behind her, the war band raised their makeshift weapons, not to stop her, but in salute. They understood now. This had never been a battle, only an ending, and a beginning. The air smelled of lightning and opened veins as Astrid approached the cathedral. Her boots sank ankle-deep into ground that was no longer earth nor water, but some terrible intermediary, warm as fresh blood, textured like rotting kelp. The cathedral loomed before her, its warped timbers now visibly pulsing, the spaces between its ribs exhaling mist that carried whispers in languages dead before the first runestone was raised. She alone walked untouched through the devastation. Where the brackish rain should have burned her skin, it beaded and rolled away. Where the ground should have pulled her under, it firmed momentarily beneath her steps. Even the wind changed direction to avoid stirring her unbound hair. The Saltborn watched from a distance, their too many jointed limbs trembling. Not in fear, but in something like recognition. The cathedral doors opened without sound. Inside, the darkness moved. What waited within? The central pool had grown to consume most of the interior, its surface perfectly still yet giving the impression of terrible depth. Shapes moved beneath, not the Saltborn or their victims, but vast, indistinct things that circled like currents around a drain. The antlered woman's face floated just below the surface, her features blurred but unmistakably focused on Astrid. When she spoke, the words formed directly in Astrid's mind, bypassing her missing tongue. You remember. It wasn't a question. Memories not her own flooded Astrid's consciousness. A coastal village not unlike the one she'd been born in, but older, much older. The people wore animal skins and carried tools of sharpened bone. They worshipped something that lived beneath the waves, offering it their firstborn sons in exchange for bountiful fishing. A betrayal. A young shaman refusing to sacrifice his child, casting instead some new magic meant to bind the deep ones away. The price. Not just his life, but all firstborn daughters for 100 generations. Their tongues cut out to prevent them speaking the binding words anew. Astrid staggered under the weight of the vision. Her hands, when had they become so pale, rose to her throat, tracing the scar tissue there. The pool showed her reflection. Her eyes had turned the same milky white as Rold's. The last bargain. The antlered woman's voice came again, softer now. You are the last. The final thread in the web they wove to keep us starving below. Around the pool, the cathedral's walls began to weep. Not water, but thick, dark blood that smelled of iron and endless depths. It formed words as it dripped. Break the silence. Speak the unspoken. Feed the hunger. Astrid understood. All these centuries, the deep ones hadn't been attacking. They'd been trying to come home. Her missing tongue itched unbearably. When she raised a hand to the scar, her fingers came away wet with something that wasn't blood. It tasted of salt and memory and power. The pool's surface trembled. Somewhere far below, something ancient opened its eyes. Above the drowning world, the remnants of Astrid's war band watched from their high ground as the cathedral collapsed inward. Not in ruin, in purpose. The timbers folded like clasped hands. The bones rearranged themselves into perfect spirals. And the pool began to rise. A column of black water stretched skyward, twisting as it climbed, its surface alive with faces both human and otherwise. The rain changed direction, now flowing upward to join it. Rivers reversed course. Even the sweat on the watchers' brows lifted from their skin in glistening droplets. One by one, the warband dropped their weapons. One by one, they walked toward the rising pillar. Not in surrender, in welcome. The world unstitched itself at the seams. Astrid stood at the eye of the ascending pillar, her scarred mouth moving around words that had waited 1,000 winters to be spoken. The missing tongue regrew itself in glistening strands of salt water and memory, each syllable taking shape as it pushed past her lips. Hr calmer cult. The storm comes cold. Stjoren rees. The sea rises. Egn Agner. The silence hungers. With each phrase, the pillar widened. The cathedral's bones dissolved into the current, their calcium joining the upward rush. The antlered woman's face fragmented into 1,000 smiling pieces, each droplet carrying some essential shard of her into the gathering storm above. Rold's presence surrounded Astrid now, not as a separate entity, but as the water in her veins, the salt on her skin, the pressure behind her eyes. She saw through time, the first villages drowning not from malice, but from the deep one's desperate attempt to remake the world that once was. The ancient shaman's betrayal, binding the sea's children away from their rightful home. The endless cycle of sacrifices meant to maintain the fragile barrier between realms. Her newly formed tongue burned with the truth. The final words came unbidden. Lo cascali opnist. The final hall opens. The sky tore. What fell away? The warband watched as the laws of the world unraveled. Trees uprooted themselves and walked toward the sea on tangled root legs. Stones softened like wax, flowing into the shapes of drowning faces. The sun bled light like a slit throat, its golden rays turning to viscous liquid midair. Those who still bore human voices screamed, not in fear, but in horrified recognition. Their memories returned all at once. They had done this before, countless times. The cycle always the same. Bind the sea, forget the binding, drown when the memory inevitably resurfaced. One by one, they stepped into the rising current. Their bodies dissolved like salt in broth. The first and last shore. Astrid awoke on a beach that was not a beach. The sand shifted beneath her feet, composed entirely of teeth. Some human, some animal, some belonging to creatures that had never walked on land. The sky rippled like the underside of a frozen lake, its dim light filtered through fathoms of black water. Before her stretched a city of coral and bone, its spires twisting in impossible geometries. Its streets thronged with shapes both familiar and alien. The deep ones had never been invaders. They had been prisoners. And she, last daughter of the betrayers, bearer of the cut tongue, had finally turned the key. From the city's heart came a sound like 1,000 conch shells blowing in unison. The welcoming committee approached. At their head walked a figure with Rold's eyes and Astrid's scar. Behind them, the new tide began to rise. The girl woke with her pillow soaked through, not with sweat, but with seawater that reeked of decaying shellfish. 7 teeth lay arranged on her bedside table in a perfect spiral. She touched her gums and felt the empty spaces where they had been. The wounds had healed overnight into smooth, pearlescent tissue that shimmered like mother of pearl when she moved her tongue across it. Down at the water's edge, the antler forest had grown. They stood now in concentric circles, their points vibrating in the offshore wind like tuning forks. Between them, the sand had turned black and glossy, reflecting not the morning sun but something deeper. The drowned city from her dreams, its coral towers swaying in unseen currents. When she stepped onto the darkened sand, her bare feet left no prints. The tide pools watched. Her father found her there at noon, kneeling before the largest antler with her mouth open in silent communion. Salt crystals crusted her lips. Her eyes were wrong. The pupils had elongated into vertical slits, the irises swirling with patterns that matched the tide marks on the beach stones. When she turned to him, the words that came were not her own. They need 7 more. Behind them, the village dogs began to howl in perfect unison. The offering. That evening, the elders convened in the mead hall with iron nails clenched between their teeth. An old superstition against evil spirits. The girl sat apart, carving symbols into her forearm with a gull's feather. The wounds healed as quickly as she made them, the blood evaporating before it could drip. The village seer, a toothless crone with fingers like driftwood, studied the markings and began to weep black tears. "This isn't possession," she whispered. "This is inheritance." Outside, the tide reached further inland than ever before, its advance silent and inexorable. The fishing boats strained against their moorings, their hulls groaning as unseen weight pressed against them from below. Nets rose from the waves empty save for one thing: teeth. Always teeth. Molars and incisors and canines from creatures human and otherwise, all polished smooth by the sea's relentless attention. They piled up on the docks in drifts, clicking together in the wind like some grotesque wind chime. The girl gathered them in her apron, humming a tune none recognized but all somehow remembered. When her pockets bulged with them, she walked into the water without hesitation. The sea welcomed her home. What walked back ashore? 3 days later, the first saltborn reached the village. They wore the faces of long-drowned fishermen, their skin taut and glistening, their eyes the same impossible silver as the girl's. Where they stepped, the ground softened like wet clay, retaining their footprints as perfect little pools that never evaporated. The elders met them with iron and fire. It made no difference. The saltborn simply waited until the torches guttered in the unnatural damp, until the nails rusted to powder in sweating palms. Then they spoke, not with mouths, but through the sudden geysers that erupted from every well and rain barrel. "You kept them from us too long." Behind them, the sea darkened with approaching shapes. Not ships. Something older. Something hungrier. The girl walked at their head, her hair grown into a living veil of kelp, her fingers webbed and glistening. In her hands she carried a necklace strung with the 7 teeth the village had refused to give. Now they would give more. Many more. The rain came first in thick salty sheets that turned the village paths into shallow streams flowing uphill against all nature. The thatched roofs sagged under the weight, reed strands sprouting white tendrils that quested for bare flesh. Children screamed as their hair tangled with kelp strands that hadn't been their moments before. The girl stood at the center square, kelp veil pulsing with each thunderous heartbeat of the approaching tide. Around her the saltborn arranged their offerings, fishhooks forged from finger bones, nets woven from grandmother's hair, buoys made of skulls packed with glowing algae. The elders' iron weapons lay in rusted heaps, runes eaten away by unnatural corrosion. One grizzled warrior made Thor's sign only to have his beard turn to sea foam, lips stitching shut with muscle silk. "Show mercy," the village chief gasped, seawater pouring from his nostrils. The girl tilted her head, silver eyes reflecting not the pleading man but something vast moving beneath the waves behind him. When she spoke, her voice came from every puddle simultaneously. Mercy was the first thing we drowned. As the Saltborn worked, the village transformed. Homes melted like wax, timbers twisting into coral formations. Tools grew gills and swam away through rising waters. The dead rose from burial mounds, eye sockets swarming with bioluminescent plankton. The girl moved through chaos, pressing teeth into each villager's palm. A burning molar for the blacksmith, an incisor tasting of sourdough for the baker, a pulsing canine for the chief's wife. Those who accepted changed instantly, bodies softening at the edges, screams becoming bubbles. Those who refused, the girl watched as Saltborn took them apart with clinical precision, arranging components along the tide line. At moon high, the sea arrived in earnest, not crashing but unfolding like a lover's arms after centuries apart. Waves carried indescribable shapes, surfaces studded with familiar faces. The antler forest sang as water reached it, bones vibrating at frequencies that liquefied stone. The girl waded out, body dissolving at the edges, becoming one with the hungry tide. Behind her, the last holdouts finally understood. This wasn't punishment but homecoming. One by one they stepped forward, mouths opening not to scream but to drink deep as the waves took them. The girl's final human thought flickered like drowning lamplight. They had always been meant for the sea. Every village built on shores was just waiting to remember. The drowned village breathed with the tides now, its coral spires expanding and contracting like gills. What remained of the humans moved through liquid streets with newfound grace, their limbs elongated, their skin taking on the sheen of mother of pearl. The girl, no longer a girl but something older, drifted at the center of the transformed settlement, her kelp hair swaying in rhythm with the deep currents. The teeth she had collected pulsed like stars in the gloom, each one singing its own mournful note that vibrated through the water. Far above, the storm still raged, the surface a churning nightmare of foam and lightning. Occasionally, a shape would fall through. A tree, a piece of driftwood, once a screaming goat that dissolved before it reached the bottom. The Saltborn paid these intrusions no mind, their attention fixed on the task of rebuilding. They worked with bones now, not wood, constructing new dwellings from the remains of what they had once been. Rib cages became arches, femurs formed support beams, skulls stacked into watchtowers with glowing algae eyes. The girl felt the hunger first, a deep, gnawing emptiness that spread through the water like ink. It came from below, from the fissures that had opened in the seafloor during the transformation. Dark shapes moved in those depths, things that had been sleeping for centuries, drawn to the vibrations of the newly awakened city. She tried to warn the others, but her voice was no longer suited for speech. Instead, she strung more teeth onto her necklace, the added weight pulling her deeper toward the fissures. The Saltborn followed without hesitation, their loyalty absolute. As they descended, the pressure changed, the water growing thicker, warmer. Strange symbols began to appear on their skin, glowing faintly in the abyssal dark. The girl recognized them from her dreams. The same markings that had been carved into the antler, the same patterns that now decorated her bones. The fissure yawned before them, its edges lined with teeth much larger than any the girl had collected. Beyond it, something stirred, its bulk displacing water in slow, rhythmic pulses. The girl reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the fissure, and the ocean screamed. The ocean's scream reverberated through the water like a physical force, shaking the bone towers and sending schools of luminous fish scattering into the dark. The girl clutched her teeth necklace as the pressure mounted, her eardrums throbbing with the vibrations. Around her, the Saltborn thrashed in the current, their newly transformed bodies buffeted by unseen forces. The fissure before them widened with an agonizing slowness, its jagged edges grinding against one another like the jaws of some colossal beast. From its depths rose a sound unlike anything the girl had ever heard. Not a roar, not a song, but something between, a noise that bypassed her ears entirely to vibrate directly in her marrow. The water grew warmer still, nearly hot now, carrying with it the scent of minerals and something older, the iron tang of ancient blood mixed with the brine of primordial seas. The Saltborn regained their composure first, their bodies adapting to the changing environment with frightening speed. Their limbs elongated further, fingers fusing into paddles, spines becoming more flexible as they oriented themselves toward the fissure. One, the former blacksmith, his hammer arm now a sleek flipper lined with cutting edges, gestured downward with a series of fluid motions. The message was clear. They were meant to descend. The girl hesitated. Though her body had changed, some human instinct still clung to her, some primal fear of the unknown dark. But the teeth around her neck pulsed insistently, their song shifting to a commanding tone that brooked no disobedience. She let the current take her, sinking slowly toward the widening maw in the seafloor. As she neared, details emerged from the gloom. The fissure's edges weren't irregular as she'd first thought, but carved with intricate patterns that matched the markings now covering her skin. The symbols glowed faintly, reacting to her presence, their light revealing glimpses of what lay below. A city, not like the transformed village above, but something infinitely older, its architecture defying comprehension. Towers of black stone twisted in impossible spirals, their surfaces alive with crawling bioluminescence. Bridges made of what appeared to be solidified mist connected structures that floated unattached to the seafloor. And everywhere, there were teeth, embedded in walls, strung on cables of sinew, arranged in elaborate mosaics across vast plazas. Some were small enough to belong to fish, others large enough to have come from creatures that would dwarf the mightiest whale. The Saltborn fanned out around her, their bodies moving with newfound purpose as they entered the city proper. The girl followed, her webbed feet barely touching the strange, spongy ground that seemed to pulse beneath her. The water here was thicker, richer with oxygen, carrying whispers in a language her human mind couldn't comprehend but her new form understood on some fundamental level. They were expected. They were remembered. A shape detached itself from one of the floating structures, moving toward them with liquid grace. At first, the girl took it for one of the Saltborn, but as it neared, the differences became apparent. Its body was more streamlined, its skin nearly translucent, revealing glimpses of internal organs that pulsed with slow, deliberate rhythms. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth skin stretched over what might have been bone, save for a single vertical slit that opened as it neared, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth. The creature, the elder, extended a hand that was more fin than limb, its webbing shimmering with embedded crystals. When it spoke, the words formed directly in the girl's mind, bypassing her ears entirely. "You have returned the missing pieces." It wasn't referring to the teeth around her neck. It meant her. It meant all of them. The realization struck like a physical blow. The village, the sacrifices, the endless cycle. It had all been leading to this moment. They weren't conquerors or invaders. They were fragments of something much older, scattered across time and tide, finally coming home. The elder turned, gesturing for them to follow as it led the way deeper into the city. The girl glanced back once at the fissure above, at the distant glow of the transformed village, before allowing the current to carry her forward. Around her, the Saltborn moved with quiet reverence, their bodies already adapting further to the environment, skin darkening to better absorb the faint light, eyes enlarging to take in every detail. They passed through districts that defied explanation. A garden of swaying kelp-like plants that sang as they brushed against passing bodies. A workshop where creatures shaped from living water toiled over incomprehensible devices. A vast, circular plaza where hundreds of identical figures knelt in perfect silence, their featureless faces turned upward. At the city's heart stood a structure that made the girl's teeth ache in recognition. A perfect replica of the antler that had started it all, grown to monstrous proportions, its tips brushing the distant ceiling of water above. Beneath it floated a being that dwarfed the elders, its body shifting between solid and liquid states, its form never settling long enough to be properly seen. The prime, the source, the reason for everything. The elder guiding them stopped at the edge of an impossibly deep pool that surrounded the antler structure, gesturing for the girl to approach alone. The teeth around her neck grew hot, their song reaching a fever pitch as she drifted forward. The prime shifted again, its form stabilizing momentarily into something almost recognizable. A face that might have been human once, before time and tide had remade it. When it spoke, the ocean itself held its breath. "You have done well, little piece of us." The praise sent shivers through her transformed flesh. Behind her, the Saltborn knelt as one, their foreheads pressed to the spongy ground. The prime continued, its voice vibrating through every drop of water in the city. But the work is not yet complete. An image flashed in the girl's mind. Other villages, other coasts, other pieces of the prime that still slept in human form, unaware of their true nature. The hunger she'd felt earlier returned tenfold. Not her own, but the prime's, an all-consuming need to be whole again. The message was clear. This had been just the beginning. The girl reached up, removing one of her own teeth, a molar that had loosened during the transformation, and added it to the necklace. The prime's approval washed over her like a warm current as she turned to the Saltborn, her body already changing further in response to the unspoken command. They would go to the other villages. The first village fell within a single tide cycle. The girl led the Saltborn procession along the ocean floor, her body moving through the crushing depths with effortless grace. The necklace of teeth had grown heavier, each new addition from the underwater city pulsing against her collarbones like a second heartbeat. Behind her, 37 Saltborn moved in perfect synchronization, their forms more streamlined now, their skin taking on the same translucent quality as the elders. They carried with them relics from the sunken city, shards of black stone inscribed with waking runes, vials of glowing algae that pulsed in time with the waves above, and most importantly, teeth. Not the small human molars and incisors of before, but massive, curved fangs taken from the prime's own collection. They surfaced at dusk, emerging from the waves onto a rocky shore where seabirds screamed warnings that went unheeded. The target village lay half a day's walk inland, its wooden palisade barely visible above the grassy dunes. The girl paused, tasting the air with her newly developed sensory pits. The village reeked of unawakened potential, its sleeping fragments calling to her like foghorns in the night. The Saltborn needed no orders. They spread out silently, some slipping back into the water to follow connecting rivers, others disappearing into the long grass where their translucent skin rendered them nearly invisible. The girl walked the main path openly, her bare feet leaving damp prints that evaporated unnaturally fast. As she moved, subtle changes manifested in her wake. Wildflowers wilted and regrew as carnivorous variants. Ants abandoned their hills to march in spiral patterns, and the very air grew thick with the scent of low tide. By the time she reached the village gates, the corruption had already taken root. Inside the walls, the villagers went about their evening routines unaware of the transformation creeping in at the edges. The blacksmith's daughter awoke screaming from a nightmare of drowning, only to find her pillow soaked with seawater. The baker's bread refused to rise, the dough moving unnaturally in its kneading trough as if alive. Children playing near the well reported seeing a shiny lady beneath the water's surface, her hair moving like kelp even when the water was still. The girl observed it all from the shadows, her presence subtly amplifying the effects. When a group of hunters returned with a stag that had walked on its hind legs and begged for mercy, she knew the time had come. That night, as the village slept, she placed the first tooth, a curved thong the length of her palm, beneath the elder's house. By morning, the entire structure had transformed into a grotesque mimicry of the underwater city's architecture, its wooden beams twisting into coral-like spirals, its thatch roof replaced by undulating membranes that filtered the sunlight into eerie blue patterns. The villagers gathered in terrified clusters as more houses followed suit. Some tried to flee, only to find the surrounding forest had become an impassable maze of flesh-like trees that bled when cut. Others turned to their gods, but the altar stones sweated black fluid that burned through prayer cloths. A handful of warriors attempted to fight the changes, their iron weapons turning to rust the moment they crossed the newly formed salt lines that now encircled the settlement. The girl watched it all with detached interest, her fingers absently tracing the teeth around her neck as she waited for the inevitable moment of surrender. It came when the village elder's wife, a woman who had lost 3 children to the sea, walked calmly into the transformed well and didn't resurface. Her husband's grief-stricken scream became the catalyst, the sound vibrating through the corrupted structures in a way that awakened something deep within the villagers' blood. One by one, they turned to the girl with dawning recognition in their eyes. She smiled, revealing her own rows of needle-sharp teeth, and spoke a single word in the prime's voice, the offering. The transformation occurred faster this time. Bodies reshaped themselves with terrifying efficiency. Skin paled and grew translucent, joints reversed, gills slit open along throats and torsos. The Saltborn moved among their new kin, guiding the changes with practiced touches, collecting the shed teeth that clattered to the ground like hail. The girl oversaw it all from the village's new center, a pulsating mound of living coral that had erupted where the meeting hall once stood. As the last villager completed their change, an unnatural tide rolled in despite the lack of nearby ocean. The black water carried with it gifts from the sunken city, tools forged from bone, armor made of compressed shells, and most importantly, a new antler, smaller than the first, but humming with the same ancient power. The girl took it reverently, feeling the prime's approval course through her like an electric current. The antler's points dug into her palms as visions flooded her mind. Dozens more villages along this coast, each hiding sleepers waiting to be awakened. But beyond them, farther inland, she saw something that made her newly developed sensory pits flare with alarm. Not ordinary peaks, but vast, slumbering shapes that might have been mistaken for rock formations by untrained eyes. And within them, something stirred, something that recognized the prime's influence and found it distasteful. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving the girl with an unfamiliar sensation, doubt. But the Saltborn were already forming their procession, the newly transformed villagers joining their ranks with eerie calm. The antler in her hands pulsed insistently, its song drowning out her momentary hesitation. There was work to do, many more pieces to collect, and somewhere in those mountains, something watched their progress with ancient, calculating eyes. The black stone cube burned in the girl's palm, its heatless fire searing revelations into her flesh as the mountain fox watched with quartz eyes that saw too much. Around her, the remaining Saltborn swayed like kelp in a shifting current, their forms flickering between solid and liquid states as the competing songs of Prime and Mountain tore at their borrowed biology. The visions from the cube had left fissures in her mind, glimpses of an age before the division, when the deep ones walked alongside the stone dreamers under skies that were not yet fixed in their current patterns. She saw the Prime as it had been then, not a singular entity but a chorus of voices, a collective will that had chosen separation over annihilation when the Great Schism came. The mountains had made their own choice, retreating into crystalline hibernation while the oceans boiled with the Prime's wounded fury. And now, after millennia of uneasy truce, the balance was fracturing again. The antler at her side pulsed erratically, its usual commanding tone splintered into conflicting directives that made her newly developed secondary heart stutter in her chest. The Saltborn nearest her reached out with webbed fingers that had begun developing unexpected joints, their usual synchronicity disrupted by the mountain's influence. She could feel their confusion like a physical pressure. They had been created for singular purpose, never meant to question, to doubt. Yet now their eyes, too many eyes, some newly formed along collarbones and wrists, held something dangerously close to curiosity. The fox yipped, a sound like shattering glass, before darting back into the mutated undergrowth. In its wake, the cube dissolved into black sand that swirled around the girl's legs before forming new patterns in the corrupted soil. Coordinates, she realized with dawning comprehension. A map, not to another village, but to something deeper in the mountains. The antler shrieked a warning, its vibrations cracking one of her fused knuckles. But the damage was done. The knowledge was in her now, burning through the Prime's conditioning like acid through flesh. She turned to the Saltborn, their once uniform transformations now diverging in alarming ways, some developing mineral deposits along their spines, others growing patches of lichen-like fur, a few even sprouting tiny crystalline formations where their gills had been. They awaited her command, but for the first time, she hesitated. The Prime's song still thrummed in her bones, but beneath it now ran the mountain's countermelody, its mathematical precision carving new pathways in her mind. Decision made, she led them away from the Carthane village, following the fox's trail deeper into the unnatural foothills. The trees here grew in perfect fractal spirals, their bark etched with runes that hurt to look at directly. The streams they crossed flowed in alternating directions depending on the time of day, their waters thick with metallic particles that formed temporary sculptures before dissolving again. At dusk, they reached the first marker, a standing stone twice the girl's height, its surface polished to mirror smoothness. When she pressed her bleeding knuckle against it, the stone liquefied momentarily, revealing a tunnel descending at impossible angles into the mountain's heart. The Saltborn recoiled, their aquatic nature rebelling against the confined space, but the girl stepped forward without hesitation. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent fungi that reacted to her presence, their glow intensifying as she progressed deeper. The air grew thick with the scent of crushed minerals and something else, something old and mechanical and alive in ways she couldn't comprehend. The tunnel opened abruptly into a cavern so vast its ceiling vanished into gloom. Before them stretched a city of geometric perfection, towers of black glass arranged in logarithmic spirals, bridges that curved at angles which defied conventional physics, and everywhere, the hum of whatever power sustained this place. But it was the figures moving through the streets that made the Saltborn hiss in alarm. They resembled the Carthane elder but perfected, tall, slender beings whose skin shimmered between states of solid and liquid crystal, their movements synchronized to some internal rhythm. At the city's center stood a structure that made the girl's teeth vibrate, a massive monolith covered in pulsating equations that changed faster than her eyes could track. One of the crystal beings approached, its form shifting to mirror hers briefly before settling into a new configuration. When it spoke, the words formed directly in her bones rather than her ears. "You are earlier than predicted." It gestured to the monolith, where the equations resolved momentarily into an image of the Prime's sunken city, but not as she knew it. This version stood proud above the waves, its spires intact, its streets thronged with both deep ones and crystal beings moving in harmony. The vision shifted to show the Great Schism, the betrayal that had sunk cities and shattered mountains. And for the first time, she saw the truth. There had been no aggressor, only fear. Fear of the surface dwellers who had begun hunting both factions, who had learned to weaponize the conflict between sea and stone. The Prime had chosen isolation to preserve what remained of its people. The mountains had chosen hibernation. And now, with humanity again reaching a tipping point of awareness, the cycle threatened to repeat. The crystal being placed a hand, if it could be called a hand, against the girl's chest, directly over her secondary heart. The contact sent jolts of something both painful and exhilarating through her system as new data streamed into her consciousness. Probabilities, timelines, potential outcomes. Most shocking of all was the revelation that she was not unique. Other hybrids existed, scattered across the world, each carrying fragments of both factions' legacy. The Prime had lied about her purpose. She was never meant to simply reclaim lost territory. She was a weapon, a final solution. The antler at her side shattered suddenly, its fragments embedding in her flesh before dissolving into her bloodstream. The Prime's voice roared through her, drowning out the mountain's song with the force of a tidal wave. The crystal being recoiled as her form destabilized. Gills sealing shut, webbing retracting, her very bones liquefying and reforming under the Prime's desperate reassertion of control. The Saltborn convulsed in sympathetic agony, their partially transformed bodies tearing themselves apart as conflicting directives warred within them. The blood running down the girl's arms had turned viscous and black, mixing with the salt water pouring from the torn sky as she knelt amidst the ruins of what had once been a thriving coastal village. Her body trembled with the warring forces inside her, the Prime's ancient oceanic call crashing against the mountain's crystalline mathematics in a storm of conflicting directives that cracked her ribs with each shuddering breath. Around her, the last of the Saltborn writhed in their death throes, their half-transformed bodies unable to reconcile the two opposing songs tearing through their shared biology. The antler's remnants still protruded from her palms, its splinters having burrowed deep into her veins like roots seeking poisoned water. She could feel the Prime's fury in every particle of her being, its desperation to erase what she'd learned in the mountain's geometric city. But the truths had taken root. The forgotten history of the schism, the surface dwellers' role in dividing sea from stone, the existence of other hybrids like herself scattered across forgotten corners of the world. The sky darkened unnaturally as the storm intensified, the clouds forming spirals that mirrored both the sunken city's towers and the mountain's crystalline patterns. Lightning struck the beach in perfect intervals, each bolt leaving glassy craters that hummed with residual energy. From these impact points emerged figures, some bearing the translucent flesh and webbed limbs of the Saltborn, others shimmering with the geometric precision of the mountain folk. But most horrifying of all were those like her, hybrids caught between states, their bodies displaying grotesque combinations of both lineages. They moved toward her with single-minded purpose, their eyes reflecting the same revelation she'd experienced underground. The Prime had lied to them all. They were never meant to reclaim lost territory. They were weapons, catalysts, sacrificial pawns in an ancient conflict that predated human civilization. The first hybrid reached her, a towering figure with coral-like growths erupting from crystalline skin, and pressed its forehead to hers. Memories flooded through the connection. Another coastline, another village, another antler-driven conversion abruptly halted when the local stone dreamers intervened. Then more. A desert where the sand moved in algorithmic patterns, a jungle with trees that grew in perfect Fibonacci sequences, all hiding fragments of the mountain's legacy. The visions shifted to show the surface dwellers' forgotten role, not as mere victims caught between two warring factions, but as deliberate architects of the schism. ancient humans had learned to harness the conflict, pitting sea against stone to carve out their own dominion. The prime's isolation and the mountain's hibernation hadn't been mutual decisions but enforced exiles. A new sound cut through the storm's cacophony, a grinding tectonic hum that made the beach tremble. The ocean recoiled from the shore in unnatural retreat, revealing blackened ruins of structures older than recorded history. From this exposed trench emerged the prime itself, no longer hiding in the deep. Its true form defied comprehension. A shifting mass of liquid darkness shot through with bioluminescent veins, its surface alternately reflecting the sunken city's architecture and the mountain's crystalline perfection. It pulsed with wounded fury, its song now a discordant scream that liquefied 3 nearby hybrids where they stood. The girl felt its attention fix on her, the weight of its gaze like physical pressure threatening to collapse her lungs. Traitor! The word formed not in her ears but in the marrow of her bones. She tried to respond, but her voice had been stolen by the transformations. Instead, she acted, plunging her antler-pierced hands into the wet sand. The remaining hybrids followed suit, their combined will channeling through her into the earth itself. The beach erupted in a geyser of black water and crystalline shards as the mountain responded at last. From the cliffs rained down the stone dreamer's final gambit, thousands of geometric projectiles that rearranged midair into a shimmering latticework aimed at the prime's exposed form. The collision of forces shattered the coastline. Water met crystal in an explosion of paradoxes. Substance that was both solid and liquid, energy that was neither light nor dark but something between. The girl found herself floating in the eye of this chaos, her body unraveling at the molecular level as the 2 ancient songs fought through her. She saw glimpses of what might come after, the prime's defeat leaving the oceans lifeless, the mountain's victory turning continents to unyielding glass, or worst of all, an endless continuation of the cycle with new hybrids bred for future wars. In that suspended moment, she made her choice. Reaching into her own chest, she tore free the secondary heart the prime had grown within her, an organ that pulsed with both oceanic rhythms and crystalline precision, and hurled it into the maelstrom. The effect was instantaneous. The warring energies collapsed inward, forming a perfect sphere of balanced potential that hovered for 3 impossible seconds before detonating outward in a wave of transformative silence. The beach froze in fractal patterns. The hybrids' bodies stabilized into new, harmonious forms. Even the prime's monstrous shape crystallized momentarily before shattering into a million luminous fragments that rained down like dying stars. As consciousness faded, the girl saw the truth of what she'd done. Not victory for either side, but something more radical. The schism had been healed. The songs had merged. And washing over her in gentle waves came the first notes of a new world's lullaby.